In this lecture, we will expand our JavaScript toolbox even more with the bind, call, and apply methods. So we know that functions are a special kind of object, right? And such as the array objects, for example, functions also get a couple of special methods which they inherit from the function constructor object, right? So in this lecture, we will talk about the powerful call, apply, and bind methods. And in a nutshell, these methods allow us to call a function and set to this variable manually. So let's see a small example here. And for that, I'm going to create an object. And in this case, it's just a very simple object. So no fancy function constructors or inheritance, none of that stuff. So just John and then the object literal syntax. So his name is John, of course, and we've done this a lot of times by now. His age, and then his job, which is a teacher. And now what we also want here is a method, and that's a method basically for John to present himself. And we are going to have two styles here. First a formal style, and then also a friendly style. So John is basically going to say a sentence in which he presents himself. And we will also make this dependent on the time of the day. So presentation is a function which accepts the style and the time of day. Okay. So depending on the style that we chose, we will have two different sentences. So if the style is formal, then we console log something. And if the style is friendly, then we say something else. So console log something else. Okay, in the formal part, we are going to say something like, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." So good, then the time of day, ladies and gentlemen. And now remember, if we want to have this symbol here, then we need to actually escape it so that JavaScript thinks that it's not closing the string, but that it's really part of the text. So and then his name. So I'm John in this case. Then we want to say how old. So or let's actually first say his job. So I'm this.job. So I'm a teacher in this case. And and now the age. Years old. So a bit confusing, but it makes sense. So now if the friendly style is chosen, then we want to start our sentence with something like, "Hey, what's up?" And then again, and now we can actually copy this. And I see I'm missing a plus sign here. So let's copy this. So then close it. And I also need to use the time of day. So have a nice plus time of day. Okay, so first of all, let's test this. So John.presentation with a formal style, and let's say in the morning. Okay, so it looks good, right? Actually, there's only one space here missing, but the rest is good. So it's just here, a space, right? And so also here. Now let's add another object here for someone called Emily. So the name is Emily, She's 30 years old, 35, and she is a designer. Okay. Now, suppose that we want to use the presentation method for the Emily object, which does not have this presentation method, right? We can use the call method to do this. So how does this work? The first argument of the call method is always to set the this variable. So let's see this. So we can say again John presentation, and now we use the call method on this function, on this method here. So call, and now as I said, the first argument here is the this variable. So if we set the this variable to Emily here, right, then the this variable here and so on, then this will no longer be John, but it will be Emily, right? And now we can set the other arguments. So let's this time use the friendly style, and it's in the afternoon. So let's check this. And it works. So now it's Emily and it still works. So we have the job and her age. And this is called method borrowing, because we actually borrowed the method from John to use it here on the Emily object. So again, the call method allows us to set the this variable here in the first argument. And we set it to Emily because we wanted to use John's presentation method, but setting the this variable to Emily so that we can use John's method on Emily, right? So that is the call method. There is a very similar method which is called the apply method, and the only difference is that this one accepts the arguments as an array. So there's only two arguments, first this variable and then an array where all the other arguments go. So it would be something like this. So John done presentation and apply in this case, and Emily, and now as I said, the array. And then in here we would set the other arguments, friendly and afternoon. Now this is not going to work because our method does not expect to receive an array as the input, right? So the presentation wants two normal arguments here. It doesn't expect to receive an array, so this is not going to work. But I just wanted to show it to you because we will actually use this later in our project. So let's just comment this out here. Alright, and let's now see the bind method. So we use the call and the apply. So the bind method is the one that's missing here. So the bind is very similar to the call method as well. So it also allows us to set the this variable explicitly. However, the difference here is that bind doesn't immediately call the function, but instead it generates a copy of the function so that we can store it somewhere. And that can actually be extremely useful to create function with preset arguments. So let's see how. So let's create a variable because, as I said, the bind method will return a function. So we have to store that function somewhere. So we're going to use the bind method to create a function with preset arguments because bind allows us to do that. So we're going to preset the friendly argument so that we don't have to input it again and again. So let's call this function John friendly. Okay. John.presentation. And now I'm going to use bind. And again, the first argument here is to set the this variable, which in this case doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to go with John. Okay. And now I say friendly. So this is the first argument of the function, of the presentation function. So the style. But I will not set the time of day, okay? This will not be set here at this point. I will just leave it like this. So let's now use the John friendly function. Because again, this method here returns a function. So the function will get stored here in the John friendly variable. So John friendly. And now there's only one argument left to be set, right? Because I already set the other one as friendly. So I can now say like morning here again. And this is just going to work as it did before. So let's see. All right. So I'm John, teacher 26. Have a nice morning. So you see how useful this is, right? So we have a function now which is always for the friendly version of the presentation method. So we can now use it for another time of the day. So John friendly again. Now let's say in the night. And again, everything that changes here now is night. So again, bind allows us to preset some arguments here. And this, what we just did here, actually has a name, and it's called currying. So currying is just a technique in which we create a function based on another function, but with some preset parameters. So exactly what we did here. And bind is extremely useful for that. And we can of course do the same for Emily. Okay, so let's say var Emily informal. So John.presentation and then bind. And this time the this variable matters again because we need to use the presentation method on Emily. So the this variable will become Emily. And now I'm going to preset this argument to formal. And I can now use it. So Emily formal and then afternoon, for example. And here we go. Good afternoon, Emily, designer and 30 years old. All right, so now we saw some example for call, apply and bind. Once again, these are more like small toy examples, but they really help you to understand what we can do with call, apply and bind. And we will actually use them in real situation in our next project. But before doing that, I want to just very quickly show you a cool real-world example right here. So let's bring back some of the code that we wrote in a lecture about passing functions as arguments. So I have the code up here. Let me see. Oh yeah, this is the one that I want. And this one here as well. Okay, so let's create some space here. And all right. Okay, and do you remember this one? So this was the function that we created here, where we then passed a callback function, which was to calculate age and calculate if someone was of full age. So imagine this like a machine which accepts a function and then applies that function to all of the elements of an array, right? So back then we had this full age function here, but actually the full age varies from country to country. So it's not always 18 years like we have here. For example, in Japan, you have to be 20 to be of full age. And in other countries, it's actually something like 16 or 17. So what we can do is to pass in a second argument for the age limit. So something like this. So we pass in a limit, and then instead of having 18 here, we say that the element in the array has to be greater or equal to the limit that we defined. Alright, so let's again start by calculating the ages. So var ages is array calc, then the years array, and then our callback function calculate age. Now, the problem with our full age function is that it accepts 2 arguments, but our array calc function here can only use it with 1 argument. So here, right, the fn function is always called with only 1 argument, which is this element of the array, right? So what can we do here? I would say that the best solution is to pass in our isFullAge function, but with the limit already preset, right? And that's what we're going to do. Do you remember how to do that? Exactly. We use the bind method, because bind allows us to create a copy of a function with a preset argument, which is exactly what we need here. And we did that before, and so now we're going to do it again. So let's create a variable again called full, but this time it's called full Japan, because I'm going to do it for Japan, because they have this limit of 20 years. So this is what we did before also, So array calc, and now we pass in the ages that we calculated before. And now we cannot simply pass in the isFullAge, as I explained before, right? So isFullAge. So we will not just pass this function like this, but we will use the bind method on it before passing it. So now we can preset the argument. So first the this keyword, don't forget this, the first thing always has to be the this keyword. And in this case, we don't really care about it. So we just say this, and then our preset limit, which is 20. Okay, and now what will be passed into the array calc function is not simply going to be the fullAge function, but a copy of the isFull function with 20 as the preset argument for the limit. So let's see if this actually works. So let's console.log the full Japan. And also let's show the ages so that we can see if this is actually correct. So ages. Okay, so yes, it seems like it's working, because here we have someone which is 18, right? But our isFullAge function tells us that this person is not of full age here, right? And that makes sense, because in Japan you're only full age when you're 20, as we specified here. So this is working. And this is another very useful way in which we use the bind method, and this is really a real world example. Cool, so now you have yet another tool in your toolbox. And that toolbox is getting really, really full, right? We are now almost ready to start our big project. So let's very quickly move on and see you in the next lecture.